Well, an ancient discovery is shedding light on the early church. The Megiddo mosaic dates back nearly 2,000 years.
Beneath the cracked stone floor of a working prison in northern Israel, something ancient was waiting, something no one expected. Not treasure, not bones, but a message. One so bold, it challenges what many thought they knew about early Christianity.
How we now have rediscovered it and can witness Christianity so far back.
Behind each of these original artifacts lies a powerful story reaching across generations.
It's kind of crazy, and how they just finally discovered it, which is pretty significant, I think.
What did a small group of believers risk everything to carve into stone nearly 1,800 years ago? And why was it hidden until now, under a site the Bible calls Armageddon? In northern Israel, not far from the edge of the Jezreel Valley, lies a location with a long and complex history. Known in ancient times as Megiddo, the area has seen countless generations pass over its soil. It's a name that often appears in biblical texts, most famously in the book of Revelation as the site of the final battle between good and evil, what many refer to as Armageddon. But in the early 2000s, it wasn't prophecy or war that brought international attention to Megiddo. It was a construction project at a modern prison and an unexpected find beneath its floors. Megiddo Prison is a high-security facility built to house inmates under controlled conditions. Like many prisons around the world, it was scheduled for expansion. In 2004, work began on laying the foundations for a new wing. But in Israel, there's a legal requirement to conduct archaeological surveys before any major digging can begin. This is not just a precaution. It's a necessity in a region where layers of history are often only meters below the surface. So before any machinery moved in, archaeologists arrived on site to assess what lay beneath. What they initially expected was fairly routine. Northern Israel is rich in Roman-era remains, and it's not unusual to find pottery fragments, road remnants, or structural walls when construction projects begin. The archaeologists assumed it would be more of the same. But as they began removing soil and debris, something unusual started to take shape. Beneath compacted layers of earth, small fragments of colored tiles began to emerge. These weren't scattered randomly. They were carefully arranged, forming straight lines and deliberate curves. As the team continued, it became clear that they were uncovering a mosaic. At first glance, it appeared to be decorative, a typical feature in Roman homes or public spaces. But further examination revealed something more significant. The tiles weren't simply ornamental, they told a story. What lay beneath the prison grounds was not part of a villa or bathhouse. It was something else entirely. It was sacred. The mosaic formed part of a floor, and that floor belonged to a space used for Christian worship. Based on the layout, artifacts, and inscriptions, it appeared to be an early gathering place for Christians, one of the oldest ever found in the region. This wasn't a church in the modern sense. There were no grand stone columns, no vaulted ceilings. It was modest. A small, enclosed room, likely part of a home or a privately used space that had been adapted for religious purposes. But despite its simplicity, the message it carried was unmistakable. In the 3rd century AD, Christianity was not a recognized or protected religion in the Roman Empire. In fact, for much of that period, it was viewed with suspicion and often hostility. Believers gathered in secret, sometimes in homes, sometimes in catacombs or isolated rural areas, away from public scrutiny. So to find a worship space from that era, complete with inscriptions referring directly to Jesus as God, was both rare and significant. The discovery gained international attention not only because of what was found, but also because of where it was found. Megiddo, already associated with biblical prophecy, now held a concrete archaeological link to early Christianity, beneath the grounds of a working prison no less. The symbolism was hard to ignore. Interestingly, the excavation team wasn't made up entirely of professional archaeologists. Over 60 inmates from nearby prisons were invited to help with the work. Under close supervision, these men were trained in basic excavation techniques and played a crucial role in unearthing the mosaic piece by piece. For many of them, it was a unique opportunity, an unexpected connection to something ancient and deeply meaningful. Over 4 years, they worked side by side with experts, removing dirt, cataloging finds, and carefully brushing away layers of history. The conditions were not always easy. Security protocols had to be maintained, weather often slowed progress, and scheduling had to accommodate the needs of the prison. Still, the work continued. Bit by bit, a fuller picture emerged. What was once hidden under nearly 1,800 years of soil was slowly returning to the surface. The find included more than just beautiful tile work. There were inscriptions in Greek, symbols, and evidence of liturgical activity. The space showed signs of being used regularly. This wasn't just a ceremonial installation. It was a place where people gathered, worshipped, and participated in shared rituals. The discovery offered a rare glimpse into the daily spiritual life of early Christians, long before the faith became mainstream. One of the more striking aspects of the site was its lack of grandeur. There were no elaborate architectural features, no gilded icons or statues. Yet the simplicity of the space seemed to speak volumes. It suggested a community of believers who were deeply committed to their faith, not in an era of acceptance, but in a time when belief could carry real consequences. The Megiddo mosaic is more than just a piece of art. It's a piece of living history. It bridges the gap between the distant past and the present, offering a rare and tangible link to one of the most formative periods in Christian history. It also provides context for ongoing debates about how early Christians viewed Jesus and how they chose to express their beliefs under pressure and in secrecy. The significance of this discovery isn't limited to theological circles. It resonates with archaeologists, historians, and those interested in how religious practices develop under different cultural and political conditions. The fact that such an important site was uncovered during a routine infrastructure project highlights the layered and unpredictable nature of history, how stories long buried can come back into view at the most unexpected times. As the mosaic floor at Megiddo was gradually uncovered, archaeologists realized that this was more than a typical historical site. The space they had discovered wasn't simply a meeting room or private residence, it was a place of worship. The structure of the room, its orientation, and most notably the inscriptions found within it, began to paint a much clearer picture. This was an early Christian worship space, one that predated many of the developments often associated with the growth of Christianity as an organized religion. The most striking discovery on the floor was not a design or a pattern, but a line of text. In Greek it read, "The God-loving Akeptus has offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial." This short sentence, carved directly into the mosaic, carries immense historical and theological weight. It is not a metaphor or an ambiguous phrase open to interpretation. It is a direct and deliberate reference to Jesus as God, something that challenges a number of common assumptions about the early Christian movement. The use of the phrase "to God Jesus Christ" is especially significant. It shows that at the time this mosaic was created, estimated around 230 AD, there were Christians who already held a clear belief in the divinity of Jesus. This predates the Council of Nicaea by nearly a century. The council, which took place in 325 AD, is often cited in modern discussions as the point at which the Church formally declared Jesus to be divine. While it's true that the council affirmed and standardized many theological positions, discoveries like this one at Megiddo indicate that belief in Jesus as divine was already present in local communities well before any imperial endorsement or church council decisions. In fact, what makes this particular inscription so powerful is how ordinary its context seems. This was not written by a theologian or Roman official. It wasn't part of a government edict or an imperial monument. It was part of the flooring in a modest worship space, likely created by and for a small local group of believers. The name mentioned, Akeptus, is believed to refer to a woman, and scholars think she may have donated a Eucharistic table, a central feature in Christian worship, in memory of someone or as a personal act of faith. In doing so, she left behind not just a gift, but a statement. This gives us a rare and personal glimpse into the world of early Christian believers. These were people who gathered quietly and often in secret, not for power or influence, but out of genuine belief. To refer to Jesus as God at that time was not a cultural expectation or social convention. It was a risk. The Roman Empire did not recognize Christianity as a legal religion until the early 4th century. Before that, Christians often faced suspicion, marginalization, and at times persecution. To publicly declare that Jesus was divine, especially in writing, was a bold act. The inscription also implies a form of organized worship. The reference to a table is understood by scholars to mean a table used in the Eucharist, the central rite of Christian worship where believers share bread and wine in remembrance of Jesus' Last Supper. This wasn't just a community meal or symbolic gesture. It was a sacred ritual, a core practice of Christian faith. And the fact that a table dedicated to God Jesus Christ was installed and acknowledged suggests that this worship was both intentional and theologically grounded. What's especially important about this find is that it adds physical evidence to what is often relied on written records alone. Much of what historians know about early Christianity comes from texts, letters, gospels, commentaries, and early church writings. These are invaluable, but they're also subject to interpretation and debate. Some argue that later scribes may have altered or expanded upon original ideas, or that the image of Jesus evolved gradually as the church grew in power. But archaeological evidence like the Megiddo mosaic offers a different kind of insight. It's tangible, fixed in place and time, and much harder to dispute. This challenges a narrative that's become common in both academic and popular discussions: the idea that Jesus' divinity was a later invention, shaped by political agendas and theological debates centuries after his life. While those debates certainly existed, the mosaic at Megiddo suggests that belief in Jesus as divine was not something imposed from above, but something that emerged naturally and early within communities of believers. It wasn't just a theological position written in books, it was something people lived by, worshipped through, and were willing to inscribe in places they held sacred. It also sheds light on how these early Christians saw their identity. They weren't experimenting with ideas or floating between different beliefs. The statement on the floor is clear, confident, and personal. It doesn't read like something imposed or rehearsed. Instead, it reflects a community that already understood who they were and who they worshipped. For many modern readers, this kind of discovery can reshape how we think about the early church. It reminds us that faith was not born in grand councils or under imperial endorsement. It was forged in small rooms, quiet gatherings, and under real threat. People like Akeptus and her community didn't wait for permission to believe. They simply believed. And in doing so, they left behind traces of a faith that was already fully formed, already sure of who Jesus was. Even more remarkable is that this message survived at all. The mosaic remained hidden for nearly 1,800 years, buried beneath layers of soil, forgotten beneath a modern prison. And yet, the words have endured, clear, legible, and as direct as the day they were placed. It's a reminder of how faith can persist, not always loudly or in the open, but steadily and with conviction. There is also something moving in how ordinary people played a role in preserving this message, whether intentionally or not. The inmates who helped uncover the mosaic, the archaeologists who carefully documented it, the local communities that allowed the work to continue, all of them became part of the story. They didn't write the original message, but they helped bring it back into the light. As the full design of the mosaic at Megiddo came into view, archaeologists and scholars noticed details that, at first glance, might have seemed decorative or symbolic in a general sense. But for those familiar with early Christian history, one element stood out immediately: a fish. Small, simple, and easy to overlook among the geometric patterns and lines of text, this fish wasn't just a visual flourish. It carried meaning far beyond its appearance. For early Christians, the fish was one of the most important and recognizable symbols of faith. In Greek, the word for fish is ichthys, spelled iota chi theta upsilon sigma. Each of those letters served as the first letter of a phrase, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. It functioned as an acronym, a quiet way of expressing core beliefs at a time when those beliefs could bring serious consequences. The fish symbol wasn't used for art or decoration alone. It was used for protection and identification. In the early centuries of Christianity, believers often had to keep their faith hidden. In many regions of the Roman Empire, Christianity was either discouraged or illegal. Public identification as a Christian could lead to social exclusion, arrest, or even execution. As a result, symbols became essential. A simple fish drawn in the dirt, scratched on a wall or carved into stone, could say what words could not. It could communicate belonging. I am a follower of Jesus, and you are not alone. At Megiddo, the fish wasn't hidden in a corner or lightly marked for only the careful observer to find. It was built directly into the mosaic floor. That decision speaks volumes. It shows a community not simply surviving under pressure, but actively, even boldly, proclaiming who they were. They were not attempting to go unnoticed. They were making a permanent statement in the very floor where they gathered. This changes the way we think about the believers who met in that space. They weren't only cautious or underground. They were rooted. They were confident enough in their faith to embed its symbols into stone. That doesn't mean they weren't still at risk. But it does show that their identity as Christians wasn't something they were willing to keep completely silent. They were creating something lasting, something they hoped would outlive them. The fish also had scriptural roots that would have been well known to early believers. In the Gospels, Jesus tells Peter and Andrew, both fishermen, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." That phrase wasn't just poetic. It became a kind of mission statement. Early Christians saw themselves as continuing that same work, drawing others in, sharing the message, and building a community through invitation and example. There's another key moment in the Gospel accounts that likely added meaning to the fish as a symbol. The feeding of the 5,000 is one of the most well-known miracles in the New Testament. In that story, Jesus takes a small offering of 5 loaves and 2 fish and turns it into a meal for a vast crowd. That miracle wasn't only about hunger. For the people who witnessed it and those who remembered it later, it became a sign of divine provision, a clear act of God working through Jesus. When early Christians used the fish symbol, they weren't just pointing to an animal or a trade. They were pointing to Jesus himself, the one who called, who fed, who revealed something bigger than what could be seen. The fish in this context became a sign of identity, of sustenance, and of spiritual truth. It wasn't just a symbol of secrecy, it was a symbol of conviction. At Megiddo, the presence of both the fish and the inscription referring to God Jesus Christ creates a kind of theological harmony. These weren't isolated pieces. They were part of the same story. The inscription declared who Jesus was. The fish symbol reminded believers of why they followed him. Together, they offer a fuller picture of how these early Christians saw their faith, not just as a set of ideas, but as something lived, shared, and remembered. The reference in the inscription to a table offered to Jesus adds yet another layer of meaning. Scholars generally agree that this was a Eucharistic table, a place where the community would gather to share bread and wine in remembrance of Jesus' final meal with his disciples. In the early church, the Eucharist wasn't just a symbolic act. It was central to worship. It was the moment when believers connected most directly with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That makes the mention of the table especially important. It shows that worship in this community was not only organized, but also deeply sacramental. They weren't gathering for discussion or fellowship alone. They were participating in something sacred. And by dedicating that table to God Jesus Christ, they were expressing a belief that Jesus was not just the center of their worship, but the object of it. The mosaic at Megiddo, then, isn't just a series of designs. It's a theological statement in tile and stone. It connects belief with practice, symbol with ritual, memory with identity. And it does so without fanfare or embellishment. There are no grand murals, no artistic flourishes meant to impress. Everything about the space is understated, almost minimalist. Yet the messages it carries are as clear and strong as anything found in large cathedrals or church documents. This contrast is one of the most striking aspects of the site. In today's world, religious spaces are often marked by visible architecture, expansive decoration, and public ritual. But in Megiddo, a quiet room, a patterned floor, and a few lines of text were enough. These early Christians didn't need grandeur to express their faith. They needed only the space to gather and the courage to say what they believed. The durability of their expression is something that still resonates. Nearly 1,800 years later, their voices haven't faded. The tiles remain. The words are readable. The fish still speaks. And in that, there's a powerful reminder. Conviction can be quiet, but firm. Worship doesn't have to be visible to be meaningful. And sometimes, the most enduring declarations come from the most unlikely places. For those studying early Christianity, the mosaic offers valuable insight. It suggests that theological clarity existed well before formal councils debated doctrine. It shows that regular believers, not bishops or emperors, were already living out and proclaiming their understanding of who Jesus was. And it demonstrates how symbol and practice worked together to create a shared identity, even when that identity came at a cost. There's also something deeply human about it. These weren't historical figures or church leaders. They were ordinary people, gathering in a modest room, committing their faith to stone. They didn't know their floor would one day be uncovered and studied. They weren't aiming for legacy. They were simply expressing what they believed. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what makes their message so powerful. The discovery of the Megiddo mosaic raises a question that lingers long after the excavation has ended. Why does this matter now? Why should a tiled floor hidden beneath a modern prison in northern Israel hold any relevance for people today, thousands of years later and far removed from the world of early Christianity? The answer, while simple on the surface, becomes more layered the deeper you go. This mosaic doesn't just offer a snapshot of the past. It brings with it a set of ideas, questions, and affirmations that still speak clearly in today's world. First, it's important to recognize what the mosaic represents. It's not simply a work of ancient craftsmanship or a cultural relic from Roman-era Palestine. It's physical evidence of Christian worship taking place in the early 3rd century. That alone is rare. Most early Christian spaces were either destroyed, repurposed, or left undocumented. Finding one still intact with inscriptions and symbols that point directly to the beliefs of the people who used it is exceptional. And it's not just what they believed, but how clearly they expressed it. The inscription, "To God Jesus Christ," is not vague or open to broad interpretation. It shows that the people who gathered in that space understood Jesus as divine. This belief wasn't something they were still debating, nor was it something imposed by external authority. It came from within their own practice, their own understanding, their own worship. That matters because it challenges a theory that has been repeated often in academic discussions, documentaries, and popular books, that the idea of Jesus as divine developed slowly over time, and that it wasn't until the 4th century that the Church decided, largely for political reasons, to call Jesus God. According to this view, early Christians may have seen Jesus as a teacher, prophet, or spiritual leader, but not as divine in the way that would later become standard Christian doctrine. The mosaic at Megiddo doesn't completely undo that narrative, but it complicates it. Here we have archaeological evidence from about 230 AD, a century before Christianity became legally recognized in the Roman Empire. That shows a local group of Christians not only referring to Jesus as God, but doing so in the context of worship. This isn't hearsay or later theological interpretation. It's carved in stone in a floor built by people who were likely facing legal and social risks for their faith. And that's what makes it so powerful. This wasn't a declaration made from a position of power or influence. It wasn't crafted in a cathedral or commissioned by a ruler. It came from ordinary people, gathering in a small private space expressing what they believed in the most permanent way they could. That kind of belief, lived, local, and costly, offers a different view of how early Christianity took shape. It also brings a sense of credibility to the faith traditions that followed. For those who read the New Testament and see Jesus referred to as divine, or who participate in Christian practices like communion or prayer, the Megiddo mosaic offers a kind of historical anchor. It shows that these ideas weren't introduced centuries later, but were already being lived out in the earliest days of the Church. The theology wasn't simply developing, it was already present in full form in communities like this one. This matters not just for historians or theologians, but for anyone who is interested in the relationship between belief and evidence. In a world where religious claims are often treated with suspicion, having archaeological support for those claims can carry real weight. The mosaic doesn't prove everything about Christianity, of course, but it adds another layer of support, another data point that connects text to practice, belief to history. And beyond the academic or theological significance, there's also something deeply personal in this discovery. It's a reminder that faith often survives in the quiet places. While empires rise and fall, while institutions change and doctrines evolve, the core of belief often lives in the hands and hearts of regular people. The mosaic wasn't preserved in a museum or kept in a church archive. It was hidden underground, beneath a prison, forgotten by the world for nearly 2,000 years. And yet, when it was uncovered, its message was still clear. That message isn't just about what the early Christians believed, it's also about how they lived. They gathered in private, adapted everyday spaces into places of worship, and used whatever materials they had to express their devotion. They weren't waiting for comfort or acceptance. They acted on conviction, even when the risks were real. That kind of courage, quiet but enduring, speaks across time. It also asks something of those who encounter it today. In an age when faith is often taken for granted or practiced out of habit more than conviction, the mosaic raises a challenging question. What would we be willing to risk for what we believe? Would we still gather, still pray, still speak if it came at a cost? The early Christians at Megiddo did. And what they left behind wasn't just a floor, it was a statement. This mosaic also functions as a kind of witness, not just in a religious sense, but in a human one. It witnesses to the fact that belief doesn't need approval to be real. That truth, when held deeply, finds ways to express itself, even if only through symbols, inscriptions, or shared meals. And it shows that what might seem small or hidden at the time can become significant later, when the world is ready to listen. In a broader cultural sense, discoveries like this remind us that history is always unfolding. Sometimes it comes to us through books and lectures. Sometimes it arrives through chance, during a routine construction project. But when it does, it offers a chance to revisit what we think we know, to question assumptions and open ourselves to new understandings. The Megiddo mosaic doesn't answer every question about early Christianity, but it does confirm that people who lived nearly 1,800 years ago believed in something deeply enough to carve it into stone. That in itself is a powerful message. As modern visitors, scholars, or believers look at this mosaic, they're not just observing an ancient artifact. They're encountering a piece of living history, a voice from the past that wasn't erased by time. That voice continues to speak, not with noise or spectacle, but with clarity. It tells of faith that was personal, sincere, and expressed with conviction long before the world around it was ready to listen. And maybe that's the real reason why this mosaic matters today. Because it shows that truth doesn't always need a stage. Sometimes it survives in silence. Sometimes it's hidden beneath the ground, waiting to be found. But when it is, it reminds us that the core of faith, whatever form it takes, isn't built on force or popularity. It's built on commitment, memory, and the quiet persistence of people who believe.